This is the battle for Avdiivka, a bloody contest of innovation where both sides use new tactics and weapons for the first time to devastating effect. Where Russian glide bombs flattened Ukrainian defenses, but Ukraine's FPV drones blew Russian armored columns to bits. We're going to get into the battle and the tactics behind it in just a moment. But first, let's take a look at the Russian plan. This is Ukraine. The Dnipro River is here, Kiev is here, and this is the eastern region known as the Donbass. Avdiivka is right here. It's an industrial city which used to make coking coal for Ukraine's huge steel mills and was once a suburb of nearby Donetsk city. But in 2014, it found itself on the front line of Russia's war on Ukraine after Moscow-backed separatists seized all of this territory, severing it from Donetsk. The two sides fought over Avdiivka in 2014, then again in 2017. Both times it was held by the Ukrainians, who turned it into a fortress, pinning the Russians back inside Donetsk. When fighting resumed in 2022, this time on a much larger scale, Avdiivka once again found itself in the thick of the fighting. Putin planned to take the whole of Ukraine, with attacks from the north on Kiev, from Crimea on the south, and a two-pronged offensive from Donetsk and Luhansk on the Donbass. But the Kiev attack quickly went wrong and was abandoned. The Crimea offensive met with some success but then stalled, leaving just the Donbass attack going. Slowly but surely, cities in this area began to fall to Russia. First was Mariupol in May 2022, then Severodonetsk and Lysychansk in June and July of the same year. Bakhmut followed in May 2023. The Russians were making ground in every direction except northwards out of Donetsk city because Fortress Avdiivka was in the way. This wasn't for lack of trying. All throughout this period, the city was heavily bombed and attacked, and while Russian troops made some progress by capturing small outlying towns, they could not take the city itself. All that changed in the latter half of 2023. The battle for Bakhmut had been long, slow, and bloody, but it taught the Russians one important thing: how to take a fortress. Grinding human wave assaults backed by huge amounts of artillery and bombs. They now planned to use this tactic to take down Avdiivka, a thorn that had been in their side for more than a decade. But the Ukrainians had also been learning a new way of warfare, one that didn't rely on trenches and howitzers, but on high-tech drones and FPV goggles. Avdiivka was the place where these two tactics would meet, with horrifying results. This is the battle where Ukraine smashed some of the largest Russian attacks of the whole war using cutting-edge technology, and where Moscow had to resort to First World War tunneling tactics and improvised glide bombs to grind the Ukrainians down. This is the battle for Avdiivka, and this is Battleboard. This is Avdiivka, a once thriving industrial city that was once home to 32,000 people. Its natural defences are a series of lakes which largely block attack routes to the northeast, and wide open fields which leave attackers with almost no cover to the southwest. But what really makes Avdiivka a fortress are the man-made defences built up over a decade of warfare. At the northern end of the city, these are anchored around 2 points. First, the coke plant, the largest in Europe, a sprawling complex 6 miles around that's filled with a warren of buildings, staircases, chimneys, railways, and above-ground pipes. Many of the buildings are made of reinforced concrete, making them resistant to bombing, and they look out over fields to the north and west and have the city at their south. To the east is a second defensive position, a slag heap, a pile of toxic industrial waste over 100 foot high at points known to the Ukrainians as Terrakon. In an otherwise flat piece of country, this provides much needed high ground from which the enemy can be spotted and fired upon. At the southern end of the city are 3 more defensive positions which sit along the main roads into the city from Russian-occupied Donetsk. The first is another industrial zone, made up of reinforced buildings with trenches dug between them. The second is Sarska Ohotka, located here, which is a complex of restaurants and hotels that the Ukrainians have turned into a military base. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, there's Zenit, a Soviet-era air defense site that once guarded a nearby airfield, which now anchors Avdiivka's southern defenses. A complex of reinforced concrete bunkers and underground tunnels meant to withstand a nuclear strike. It sits atop a hill which commands a view of the surrounding countryside. It is these defenses which Russia has spent the last 18 months trying and failing to breach. In January 2022, the front line between the two sides was here, but by September 2023, the Russians had advanced around the city, like so. On the northern flank, they've captured Balka, Kamyanka, and Krasnohorivka. And in the south, they have taken Optnya and Vodanya. As October begins, it is from these flanks that Russia will launch its latest assault, attempting to bypass Avdiivka's fearsome defenses altogether in a pincer movement. The goal is to cut the lone supply road that comes into the city from the west, the 00542, which is located just here. Leading the charge on the northern flank is the 114th Brigade. Once a part of the Donetsk People's Republic, a sham government based out of Donetsk city, all pretense of independence has now gone and it has been absorbed into the regular Russian army. They are backed by the 21st Brigade, also formerly of the DPR, and Russia's 15th Brigade. Their mission is to head south and west from their starting point in Krasnohorivka, through Stepove and Berdichi, and into Avdiivka, which sits on this key road. On the southern flank are the 9th and 110th Brigades, also formerly of the DPR, and the 55th Brigade of the regular Russian army. Their objective is to attack from Vodanya up through Povishne and Tonyenke, and then cut the 00542 road from the south. Then there's two more Russian brigades attacking Avdiivka from the southeast. The 1st Brigade, who have been given the unenviable task of assaulting Zenit, and the 57th, who are attacking up this road towards Sarska Ohotka. Leading the defense of the city are the Ukrainian 110th Brigade. Formed at the start of the 2022 invasion, they were sent straight to Avdiivka and have been here ever since. Ukraine typically tries to rotate their units every few months to rest and recuperate, but the 110th has now been here for 18 months with no break. They're spread out across the south and east. One detachment is holding Zenit, another is spread between Sarska Ohotka and the southern industrial zone, and a third is guarding the eastern approaches to the city. Helping them cover the southern flank are the 53rd Brigade and 36th Marine Brigade stationed just north of Vodyana. And on the northern flank is the 116th Territorial Defense Brigade, reinforced by the 2nd Presidential Battalion along with Omega and 3rd Special Forces groups. Assuming roughly 5,000 men per brigade, this gives us a total Russian strength of 40,000 men, roughly in line with Ukrainian estimates made during the battle, and 20,000 men on the Ukrainian side, though some sources put it slightly lower at 15,000. The battle begins on October the 10th, when the Russians gather roughly 3,000 of their men and launch a huge attack southwards from Krasnohorivka and northwards from Vodyana. Tanks equipped with mine plows lead the charge. Their job is to clear a path through Ukrainian minefields and other obstacles while using their armor to soak up damage from artillery shells and anti-tank rockets. Lined up behind them, in single file, are dozens of more lightly armored vehicles filled with troops. They're hoping to use the protection of the tanks to get as close to Ukrainian lines as possible before unloading their infantry, who will storm the defenses. But what they're not counting on are Ukrainian FPV drones. Small, fast, highly maneuverable aircraft strapped with explosives and piloted using onboard cameras linked to virtual reality headsets. Using just a few $100s of components, these can make extremely precise hits on tanks and armored vehicles, ripping them to shreds. They prove extraordinarily effective, and Russia's initial attacks in both north and south are devastated. The Russians take a little time to regroup, bringing in the 30th Brigade on the northern flank, and then launch another huge armoured attack on October the 23rd. The assault was caught on camera in this area by drones of the 110th Brigade, who said 500 troops and 50 tanks and armoured vehicles were involved. In it, you can see how Ukraine has incorporated drones into layered anti-tank defences. First to hit the tanks are artillery guns, which have the longest range. Then come anti-tank missiles like the US Javelin, followed by landmines. Once the vehicles are damaged or disabled, they're sitting ducks for the drones. You can see what happens here when a drone hits a weak spot of this tank. This forces the Russians to change tactics, and they abandon their pincer plan along with their tanks and armored vehicles. Instead, infantry are split up into small groups, told to advance on foot, and thrown at Ukrainian defences in waves, aiming to grind them down. Though brutal and bloody, this tactic is effective. On October the 28th, the Russians capture Terrakon and raise their flag on top of it. It's too close to Ukrainian lines for them to use as an attack position, but it means the Ukrainians can no longer use it to shoot at them. To head off any further Russian advances, Ukraine now deploys the 47th Brigade near the coke plant. This is one of the country's best fighting units and is equipped with American M1 Bradley fighting vehicles which prove adept at destroying their Russian counterparts. The 47th helps stop any further Russian advances in the north. In the south, the 53rd and 36th are also doing a good job holding this line, helped out by the wide open fields that provide the Russians with almost no cover. And in the southeast, these dug-in fortifications are still proving too difficult for Russia to take. It is now November and the rains arrive, making the job of advancing even harder. It is at this moment that Putin's generals unleash their own brand new weapon. The weapon in question is a glide bomb. This is basically a big Soviet-era dumb bomb originally designed to fall straight down from an aircraft, but which has been modified with a glide module. This allows the bomb to glide to its target, meaning they can be dropped away from air defenses, giving the Ukrainians almost no chance to stop them. They are nowhere near as accurate as Ukraine's drones, so they're no use against moving targets like vehicles. But they're very, very effective against fixed defenses like these. Russia has huge stockpiles of these bombs and uses them relentlessly, sometimes more than 70 per day. In December, this advantage begins to tell. One by one, Ukraine's 3 defensive positions in the south begin to buckle. First is the industrial zone. Russia redeploys the 55th Brigade from the southern flank and sends it in. In addition to the glide bombs, soldiers use First World War tunneling tactics to break these defenses. Teams of sappers dig underneath Ukrainian positions, plant explosives, then detonate them, blowing a hole in the defensive line. Russian troops then rush through the tunnel and into the breach, pushing the Ukrainians back. Then comes Tsarska Okhotka. Again, the Russians use tunnels to their advantage. This time, they don't dig them themselves, but make use of what's already there. Unbeknownst to the Ukrainians, Putin's troops spend weeks clearing out an old pipe that runs underneath their feet. Then, on January 17th, 150 soldiers from the 60th Sabotage Assault Battalion are sent crawling through it. They pop up here, behind Ukrainian defenses, and cause havoc. Tsarska Okhotka quickly falls, as does this residential neighborhood. Ukraine takes troops from the north and throws them into a counterattack which retakes the restaurant complex. This succeeds, but the damage is already done. Russia has a foothold in this neighborhood and cannot be dislodged. Then, on January the 22nd, Russia's 1st Brigade almost succeeds in cutting off Zenit, the 3rd and final defensive position. Setting off around the bunker in a pincer movement, their aim is to join up with the 60th Brigade and cut this road which connects Zenit to the rest of Avdiivka. After a couple of days of heavy fighting, the Ukrainians manage to keep this road open, but only just. The defenses in the south of Avdiivka are now on the verge of collapse. Around the same time, Russia also begins to make progress towards the coke plant in the north. In late December, they capture a set of railway tracks that used to serve as the first Ukrainian defensive position. In early January, they begin pushing beyond these train tracks and into the open fields where troops and tanks alike are hammered by the Bradleys of the 47th Brigade. In one famous battle in this area, a Bradley, which is really only designed for fighting infantry and other armoured vehicles, manages to take out one of Russia's newest tanks. The T-90M is blinded by the Bradley's autocannon fire, disabled, and sent careening into a tree where a Ukrainian FPV drone finishes it off. Struggling to advance on the coke plant directly, Russian forces in the north take lessons from those in the south and bypass the defences altogether. In early February, the 114th Brigade, with fresh reinforcements from the 74th Brigade, launched an attack here, the Avdiivka neighborhood just to the south of the coke plant. This is a Ukrainian weak spot. Troops which were defending here had been moved away to help in the south, and the Russians punched through. Advancing with frightening speed, the Russians quickly approach the 00542 road upon which all of Avdiivka's defenses depend. On February the 4th, Ukraine reacts by sending the 3rd Assault Brigade into the city. This is one of their most elite units, known for winning battles against all the odds. The brigade arrives with a bang, charging headlong into Russian lines and successfully pushing them back from the road. A post on the unit's Facebook page claimed to have inflicted 4,200 casualties, including virtually wiping out the 114th and 74th Brigades. The unit said the 15th, 21st and 30th also took casualties, and that the 55th Brigade, which was previously down here, and a new brigade, the 35th, were also in the area. While we can't verify those claims, videos they posted did show heavy fighting. Despite the 3rd Brigade's heroics, Avdiivka's defenses are now fatally punctured, and instead of holding the city, the brigade will actually help cover the retreat. The 3rd Assault Brigade seems to have provided cover for those in the south, holding open routes for them to travel out of the city, while the 47th seems to have provided cover for those retreating from the coke plant. While not a rout, the retreat seems to have been disorganized. Some units said they were given orders to withdraw, while others said they took the decision for themselves to avoid being cut off and surrounded. The most complicated evacuation played out down here at the Zenit position. This is Zenit. The complex the Ukrainians are defending is here, the road leading into Avdiivka is here, and here's where the Russians are. Inside the bunker at this moment are units of the 110th Brigade who are preparing to leave it for the first time in 18 months. Their situation is dire. Ever since January, the unit has been having to ration ammunition, food, and water after being almost cut off. Now, with what little supplies they have, they're going to have to run a gauntlet of Russian troops to try to make it back to their own lines for safety. On February 13th, they're given the order to withdraw. Under the cover of darkness, small groups of men head off towards Avdiivka. They're repeatedly ambushed along the way. Glide bombs and artillery rain down on the soldiers, whilst evacuation vehicles are blown up by Russian FPV drones. Soldiers lose track of their comrades in the dark. Amid the falling shells, some of those who vanish into the night are never seen again. But some do make it out alive, following their comrades through the city and out to safety. In the end, there are just 2 groups left inside Zenit. A small detachment of soldiers and 6 wounded men they're trying to get out. With badly injured legs, these men cannot make it on their own. But time is fast running out as the Russians close this gap. Eventually, these men are left with no other option but to leave their comrades behind with a promise to send vehicles to collect them as soon as they can. They leave Zenit as fog rolls in, reportedly traversing a gap in Russian lines just 120 yards across and then humping it 4 miles across open fields and to safety. The wounded men are left alone to wait for vehicles that never come. Instead, they're greeted by Russians from the 1st Brigade who take the bunker on February 16th. Here's video which shows the Russians raising their flag over this former Ukrainian bastion. More video, which we're not showing, reveals the bodies of the 6 men left behind. Ukraine says Russia shot them dead in cold blood. We're back in Avdiivka. The Zenit position we just saw is down here, and here's where we left the rest of the battle. One by one, units are falling back towards the coke plant and then along the 00542 road out of the city. Russian forces, realizing a full retreat is underway, swarm the city, raising their flags as they go. The last building to be evacuated is the coke plant. By the morning of February the 16th, there are around 1,000 soldiers still inside. That includes units of the 3rd Assault and 47th Brigade. The 3rd Assault are given orders to withdraw on February 16th and make it out by the following morning. The 47th leave last, shortly before Oleksandr Syrsky, the newly promoted head of the Ukrainian army, publicly announces the withdrawal. Fortress Avdiivka has fallen, but it has cost the Russians dearly to take it. One of Putin's own soldiers claimed afterwards that 16,000 Russian troops died in the effort. We simply don't know if that's true, and Ukrainian losses are even harder to work out. President Zelensky later claimed that for every 7 Russian soldiers lost in the battle, Ukraine lost just 1 man, which would put Ukrainian casualties around 2,000. But again, we simply do not have the information to verify or dispute those claims. Whatever the truth, it seems very likely that the Russians lost more men, in large part thanks to Ukraine's defensive tactics. Throughout the battle, Ukraine was desperately short of artillery ammunition, thanks in large part to its Western allies failing to deliver promised shipments of shells. But the Ukrainians adapted to use FPV drones instead, which proved devastatingly effective. In fact, these tactics have now become standard practice across the front line. Tactics which work something like this. Say we have a Ukrainian defensive position here, a typical trench dug into a tree line to provide some cover. And here's a Russian armored column coming to attack it. If the Ukrainians have had time, they will have laid a first line of defenses somewhere out in the fields they're guarding. A line of landmines, perhaps also some barbed wire and tank traps. In order to get at the Ukrainians, the Russians will first have to navigate this. If they're lucky, they'll have a tank with a mine plow leading the column that can clear a gap. Otherwise, they'll just have to hope they can steer between the explosives, maybe losing a couple of vehicles along the way. Behind that line of defenses will be artillery and anti-tank weapons pre-sighted on routes of attack, ready to open fire the second the Russians drive into them. In the early days of the war, this would have been Ukraine's main line of defense, but both anti-tank missiles and artillery shells are now in very short supply. The main line of defense is now here, a drone zone that is within range of FPVs which will hunt down any vehicles which survive these defenses. For the FPVs to work, surveillance drones have to be in the skies spotting the Russian columns advancing. Orders are then relayed to a drone unit which deploys behind the front line and launches their drones. Guided by the surveillance drones, these FPVs then spread out and hunt down any remaining Russian tanks or armored vehicles to blow up. Sometimes that's all that's needed. The FPVs are enough to blow the Russian vehicles to pieces. Other times they'll merely disable the vehicles. Then grenade-dropping drones, similar to the FPVs but with a mechanical grabber underneath that drops a grenade, will move in. They will target the open hatches of tanks or vehicles, dropping explosives through to set fire to the fuel or ammo, guaranteeing the vehicle cannot be used again. It was this defensive tactic that proved so effective in repelling the early attacks on Avdiivka, and why we believe the Russian casualty count was so much higher than Ukraine. In fact, these tactics were so effective, they're now standard practice for Ukrainian units all the way up and down the front line. Already, it seems likely that Ukraine will be remembered as the war that pioneered the use of drones on the battlefield. And if that's the case, then Avdiivka deserves to be remembered as the battle where the full power of drones was realized for the first time. Thanks for watching. If you like this kind of content and want to see more in your feed, don't forget to hit like and subscribe, or click the buttons on screen to watch other episodes.